Alrighty, we are back. So our next performer is Billie Delaney, and I think she actually lives up here in Brownsmead now, although I know her from Graveyard Point out in Bristol Bay, where she is a monster fisherman. Anyway, this is Billie Delaney, and I'll let her tell you anything else she thinks you need to know about her. Come on up, Billie.
How's everybody doing tonight? Thanks for hanging in there. Awesome. Well, I'm going to be about maxed out on my time, so I want to get right to it. Earlier today, I had the awesome opportunity to get together with around 50 women from the fishing and maritime industries to talk about what it's like to be a human being and a woman in the workplace, which are some subjects that I think have been at the forefront of a lot of people's minds lately. I'm going to read two pieces tonight that reflect some of my experiences with that. The first one is about some of the relationships that have sustained me when I've allowed them to, some of the relationships that sustain us in the workplace. And it has some excerpts from some love letters that I sent and some I never sent spliced into it. The second one I wrote a long time ago during a real bad crab season on the Washington coast. Calling this one Alone Together. In the winter of 2010, someone from town had visited most of the canneries in Naknek, leaving behind a string of giant spray-painted phalluses on a selection of skiffs and boats. Buildings and equipment. People with good humor left them up for the duration of the season. The Passion Pit was what we called the little 23-foot cruiser. The Passion Pit and the P9 sat behind piles of outdated processing equipment in the cannery scrapyard. The two boats were remnants of a fallen setnet empire and had been abandoned in the wreckage there for over a decade. After we patched it up and painted it white, several people commented that it resembled a Caribbean drug runner. YAC, the old acronym for the plant we fished for, was tagged across the side in addition to the phallus. The previous winter, Yardarm Knot had been acquired by a large Japanese company, which had fish plants and assets strung across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. It's hard to find the time to write when I'm so tired. I look forward to going to the bathroom and eating, and I need all the sleep I can get. I got that letter with the dream you had in it, the one where we were in a little skiff trying to grapple the islands outside of Sitka Harbor to pull them into us. I miss you. I don't wish you were here, but sometimes I wish we were both somewhere else, like on a little island where nothing could touch us. The P9 had belonged to a setnet baron by the name of Al Bowman, who had died a couple of years before I arrived on the scene. Supposedly, he had bought the little aluminum craft on the upper Yukon, hoping to use it as a tender. In a shipping nightmare, it had arrived 4 years later, stripped of its motors, wires, and hydraulics. It had sat anchored at the end of some of the sites on the far side in the 1980s and then retired to the junk pile, a private place for break time trysts. Last week, when the fishing was slow, we went to town and I saw my old friend Felicity. She moved up to Naknek to teach school last year. She's selling hot dogs to drunk fishermen outside the bar and making a killing. She told me that one night after the bar closed, someone had stolen her car, a powder blue sedan. She had paid $1,000 for, and they had driven it off the Cutbank Cliff at the mouth of the Naknek. Nothing was stolen. They had just gunned it and jumped out. A crime of passion, I guess. They hit 5 other cars that night, and in the morning they lay overturned in the mud like beached whales. I slept in the Passion Pit the first season I showed up there looking for work. 70 degrees feels like a sweltering day in Alaska. The boat would trap in the heat, and the windows would get all sweaty in the morning. There are 2 full-length bunks in the little 23-foot cruiser. Piles of old foam mats are stacked up. The yellow foam retains 10 years of fluids exchanged between bored and lonely cannery workers, occasionally fishermen. The first thing we did was to rip out the insides when we started fixing her up, places we would have spent time too if we were stuck in town for the whole season. The Bristol Bay fishery seems to take place in the same way most do, just at a more rapid pace. That's what makes it feel so intense, I think. The people who fish at Graveyard Point rarely make it back to town during the season. Every interaction you have at the bars, at the grocery store, at the library seems sacred. like stolen time. Without cell phones, the present becomes a cherished moment. Nowadays, everybody has a Bristol Bay wireless phone, and their coverage has improved, but it's still patchy. You have to find your special spot where the phone will work, a patch of tundra on the bluff, the top of the cannery water tower, the lower dock when it isn't crowded. The place I stayed my first season at Graveyard Point was on the second story of one of the larger buildings. The front half of the building didn't leak so bad. You could see the rust-brown patches of corrugated roofing tacked on from the outside. One could crawl up to the top portion of the pitched roof from a 55-gallon drum that sat in the hallway amidst piles of old web and cork line. Discarded clothing and inches of settled river silt. The back of the building will cave in soon if no one stops the water from coming and rotting the whole structure. But there isn't much time for that kind of maintenance before the fishing season. No one used the top floor anymore. The only entrance was a rickety staircase constantly threatening to collapse. The whole building shook when someone was ascending or the wind blew. But it was the best cell phone reception around. And from the front rooms, you could see the skiffs anchored in Graveyard Creek, keep an eye on what was going on. You were protected from the wind and the rain and somewhat from the swarms of mosquitoes. I heard so many conversations up there, people with longing, calling home. There were an array of devices improvised for smoking weed strewn about the Passion Pit. Bud Light cans with holes poked in them and twisted aluminum foil pipes, used condoms, and a few stray orange gloves. When I slept there, I had laid a tarp down over the mess and hid my dry bag in the stalk of alders between the scrapyard. I'd heard some kids come by late at night a few times, no doubt looking for privacy. I coughed loudly and they didn't bother me too much for the week I stayed there. All of a sudden, it looked less like a den of sin and more like a nest of love, where lovers had documented their consummated love, the etchings and Sharpie ink, making solid what might have felt like a month-long dream. Some things written in other languages, a throwback to the changing politics of the labor market and the canneries. Mostly just initials and hearts, initials inside of hearts. The bay's littered with that stuff, one of 1,000 places people went to hide together. Then, as in now, I can feel your body moving away from me, from that little upstairs room in New Orleans, with the tree outside my window that was always filled with birds in the morning. And I could hear the hot clap of thunder, gunshots, and the train crossing St. Claude Avenue at night in the rain, as you work that bicycle in circles towards your house. Here it's 3:30 in the morning, and I can't hear anything but the hum of the electric heater by the bed. This modern motel stifles all sound. But where the curtains part, I can see the street light always on and the condensation streaking down the window, where it has also begun to rain as your body slips out of the harbor. The exodus happens quickly at the end of the season. Up and down the cut bank where the set netters have come to make their camps, the color gets drained from the countryside, packed up and loaded into skiffs that have been beached on the high tide. Until then, you don't really realize how littered the landscape had become. Camping stuff, rain gear, kayaks, buoys, gas cans, four-wheelers, all necessarily bright things that would bloom out of the rainy days. The landmarks you had spent the summer committing to memory disappear in just a short while. Everything goes back to the more muted gray, rust, and rot, rich greens, the colors of the tundra, and us back to our lonelier lives. Thank you. I'm just going to get right into this next one. Like I said, I wrote this a while ago, and it was during a pretty crappy dungy season on the Washington coast. A parade of storms marched north along the coast this year, making a mess of things. It blew so hard it blew the gulls off their perches on the pilings, sending them up to wallow in the blurry pastures and pick fights with the blacker birds. I saw all this through the sweaty windows of work trucks. It took us nearly 3 weeks to finish gear work, to rip the deck apart and put it back together, dragging mud from the windswept lot where the pots were stacked up and the gravel parking lot of Gear Locker, where we argued about the radio station, pulled line off of coils around a stop sign next to a church in a wet snow. Back to the corner of the slough where the boat would only come up with the tide and then sit down in a nest of cold mud over at Amco. The paper touted them as the worst storms in a century. When the power wasn't out, there was still coffee at the bar where we took lunch. And the television would tell us all about the floods rolling downriver from other towns. Small businesses, American businesses, had been destroyed. The water had already claimed the life of a mother of two, the wife of a fisherman, when her car was swept into an angry creek. At the mouth of the Columbia, it seems, most tragedies have come from upriver. But I would keep my head down anyway and read the paper while the day drinkers would all sit around saying what a shame it all was, saying it never used to flood like that before. I never said that there had never been so much concrete in the river basins, and the water seemed like it had always had more room to swell. We make most of our own hardships. I kept my mouth shut and admired the smoke-stained photographs of workmen reclining in the gaping mouths of freshly notched trees that had fallen a long time ago. The same pictures that adorn the mantles of pressboard double-wides all over Pacific County. And I would take my time at lunch because I love old men. More than most things, I love drunks who tell me stories that make me laugh. There's a certain cultural nepotism in the fleet that makes the people you encounter there unique. In the late afternoon, when I haven't slept, I stare at the bolts on the crab block as they turn, counting them over and over again, thinking that they remind me on the bolts of the wheel of a freight train. When I was young, I used to think that freight trains could take me anywhere, and I regarded the piece of deck equipment with the same sense of fear and admiration. Anymore, it seems that all the roads have been named, and the trains just drag themselves tired back and forth across the country. Likewise, the boats go out and come back in, and they'll never make it any further west, because they tried for years, as though searching for the edge of a flat earth or a flat sea. But if they had found it, they would only have come back, rushing back in to sit around bars early in the day and tell stories about how they had peed off of it. The season started late and there wasn't much crab. Everyone had money problems, and this animosity kept growing like it probably wouldn't have if we were making more. The animosity kept growing until none of us liked each other. I've seen guys I work with have bad dreams. I remember one guy would wake up punching the wall. I worked with a boy once who would talk in his sleep. He would have the sweetest expression on his face while he did it, talking to his pillow, and he would rub his face against it, hugging the nest of soiled sweatshirts to his body. I've seen older guys do it too, but when they did it, they looked young and vulnerable. That year, I kept having this nightmare where I would be standing inside of this orange circle of light cast by a street lamp. I would be standing alone except for the crumpled cigarette butts scattered around me, casting shadows like inchworms on asphalt. It looked like the scene outside the bar when you've come in late and try to make it up in time to have one more beer. In the dream, I would be fine standing there, but if I stepped outside of the circle of light, I would be overwhelmed by the crowd of young men that surrounded me, circling like wolves, cloaked in realtree, a swarm of lifted trucks, blasting new country romance songs. I would be overwhelmed by the piles of things accumulated in people's yards and houses collapsing under the weight of the rain, bottles breaking and being recycled. I would be overwhelmed by a grinding sea of people, all screaming for recognition. Either that, or I would be standing alone on deck, surrounded by the light of the sodiums. Birds would fly through and tangle in the rigging, and outside of that circle of light, the water was so clean and big, I would disappear. Pon pon, pon pon, pon pon. I heard it coming up from the engine room with a pair of dry gloves. I poked my head in all red-faced, and I heard the radio going off. It was the Coast Guard saying they had received a call about a singular red flare sighted in our vicinity. It must have been about midnight, but then it gets dark so early that time of year. There must have been about 20 boats there in shallow, and I wondered for a moment if it couldn't have been me somehow that had set off the flare, wanting someone to drop in with a helicopter and get me the hell out of there. Then I had the thought that we should just run for it, just keep heading out farther west, away from this string of sad little towns, back to some choices I had made so I could make different ones. Away from the fat men with broken teeth staring out of wheelhouse windows at night and all of that yellow light. No one came back on the radio but for one guy who sounded drunk and said he thought he'd seen a red light way up on the beach, like fireworks, he'd said. The Coast Guard thanked him. I thanked him silently and said a prayer for all the other small-town heroes who had helped to clear the 2-lane highways of debris after the storm. Then I put my hat on and I hauled the next string. That morning I slept for 3 hours. I dreamt the only human outcroppings along the coast were scattered roadside fireworks stands covered in moss, and casinos with great big neon signs, flashing arrows, fantastic as any invitation to sin, lights reaching out farther than even the spectrum of the Fresnel lens. I dreamt that one of the fireworks stands had gone up in flames, explosions falling down the coast like dominoes from here to California. It was beautiful, and we never went back. When I woke up, there was a soft blue light coming in through the Visqueen tacked up over my bunk, which was perspiring gently. We went up to the diner when we got back to town, slouched over the table. Reading the paper, I heard the waitress complaining about the weather, saying something about a 100-year storm. Seems like someone must have said that every year, and I thought it must have been 100 long years around here. Thank you.